I've never been part of a so-called mega church. Mostly I've just stayed in smaller sized churches throughout my life. I do remember, though, the travesty of a preacher stepping down in my home congregation to go plant an inner city church. I thought I was like maybe like 6, 7, 8. I thought no one else could do what he did. Thought the church would fall apart or something like that, and yet someone else filled the pulpit and did a great job. But I also hear the stories of other churches where leadership matters much more. I hear the stories of big name pastors who become synonymous with their churches. And not too long ago, I heard a frustrating tale when a famous pastor at a church you'd probably recognize stepped down as he was getting up there in years. This time, not a scandal, as far as I know. But I heard from a couple that attended this church that they no longer attended the church. They just came because they liked the preaching, his preaching. That was what kept them at church. Now they go to what my dad used to call the church at Fifth and Bedpost, as in they sleep in on Sunday mornings. Well, today on the show we have David Ruybalid. David is a trauma-informed pastor, writer, and speaker who helps individuals recover from religious trauma and explore faith with compassionate curiosity. As the co-founder of the Religious Trauma Network, he creates safe spaces for those questioning Christianity to process doubt, rediscover hope, and heal. And we are going to talk about the very situation presented at the top of the show. What happens when we place undue focus on church leadership and put too much stock into impact? Welcome to Christianity Without Compromise. I'm your host, Jake Doberenz. In each episode, we explore elements that are central to the Christian faith. And often we identify an idol that's crept into our lives, and then we smash it. We want to recover a faith that actually looks like Christ, rooted in Scripture and the early church and shaped by the Spirit. Let's get back to the basics. Let's get back to a Christianity without compromise. Follow me on Threads at Jake Doberenz, and subscribe to our Substack at jakedoberenz.substack.com so you can get each new Tuesday episode and Friday newsletter right in your inbox. So are you ready? Let's get focusing on Jesus. David, thank you for coming on the show. We appreciate it here at Smashing Idols Podcast.
Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate the invite.
Yeah, I like talking with interesting people. I think we're another connection via Threads, maybe. I don't know. That's how I find half my guests these days.
Yeah, that's how we met. Yep.
Absolutely. That's where all the cool people are, everyone. On Threads. Go follow me on Threads for sure. I get into at least one fight a week where people tell me I'm demon-possessed and a heretic. It's so much fun. You got to be there. Okay. Anyway, let's just get into the actual topic at hand here, and I want to cue David up with a story here to begin. So take us back in time here, David. During a sermon, your son turned to you and asked a very important question after a seemingly inspirational line from the preacher. Tell us about that question and what it shows has become too much of a focus in our churches.
Yeah, so my son really enjoyed watching Buck Denver, which was created by Phil Visser, who, if you're familiar, he created the Veggie Tales. And if you pay attention to him and kind of what he said over the years, he talks about how when he launched Veggie Tales, he looks back now and realizes how much it pushed into character development, but in a like moralistic type way. And so there's been times in some of his creations since where he's kind of offset that. So with Veggie Tales, there was a song that was, with God, little guys could do big things too. And so when I was 12, 13 years old, that was a song, with God's help, little guys could do big things too was the song. Well, when he created Buck Denver, one of the one of the episodes I remember was to offset that. And it was, God doesn't want us to do big things. God just wants me. And so my son watched that over and over and kind of learned that piece that's reality about the character of God and who he is. Well, I was a worship pastor at a mega church here in Arizona for about 4.5 years. And I'm sitting in the back of the service with my son after I lead worship, and the sermon's on, and it's going. And the speaker's, giving, as you said, an inspirational talk. And he's like, God has created you to do big things. And my son leans over to me and says, Dad, I thought God just wanted me. And it was one of those moments of the tension of the reality of the pressure that we put on what does God really want? And what are we created for? And what does our relationship look like? And if we're called to do things, what does that come out of? And what does that say? And where does purpose play into that? And I think in a lot of ways in our Christian circles, especially here in America, that's always about bigger and better, we've kind of gotten it wrong.
Yeah, well, thank you for relating that story. Um, that story is probably similar to what a lot of people have experienced. You have one part of the church telling you something about being big and things, but then you have faithful voices that are reminding us, no, we don't actually have to be big and crazy. I know from my own upbringing, I grew up with the book Do Hard Things. Alex and Brett Harris, and Chuck Norris wrote the foreword to that book, and it was all about these Christian kids founding nonprofits and curing diseases or whatever, and just doing big crazy things. And so, yeah, I thought I had to do that. I actually did start a nonprofit when I was 15 and tried to be all big and cool and stuff. And yeah, kind of a little bit of an overachiever myself, and have a little bit of that idol for sure. But yeah, that's a part of Christian culture, isn't it? Just
Yeah.
there's this strain that has become too common, focuses on impact, focuses on those big things, lifts up people, and um, I don't know, everything's about platform and influence now than it is about just kind of faithfully following Jesus.
And
It's not so great.
I think that it's, at least in the northern hemisphere, a bigger problem, and particularly in America.
I would agree with that, and you're right that I shouldn't lump in the entire global church into that. And it is a little bit more of a problem in our more individualistic, probably societies, as opposed to societies with some other different values and things. And we have our problems; they have their problems. They're just different. So maybe you can kind of help us here, David. Like, talk to us about how we got into this mess, and introduce us to this term that you use with me, like institutional messiah.
Yeah.
Why do leaders and entire churches get so obsessed with this kind of messianic mindset, and have to think they have to go so big?
Yeah, it's a secular cycle. I mean, there's no uh, the cycle of, I would say it starts with belief teaching, and that shapes the leaders, and then the leaders bake the culture, and the culture speaks the same sort of language, and because what defines a culture oftentimes is language. So it's a cycle of just kind of a nonstop roller coaster that we're on. I think there's a lot of things that contributed to it. I think, without digging deep into it, things like the doctrine of discovery, things that really pushed us to even say, no, we can claim the land and the resources in the land as we go west, because the natives are not accurately, being as productive as they should be according to Genesis 1:27. So I think you could tie things all the way back to like the founding of America and the push to the new world. But I think that what I've seen as I've looked at American history specifically is I've seen that the Second Great Awakening in the 1800s really pushed us into a place where there was a shift from the way in which evangelism was done almost in a more of a reformed, almost a Calvinistic way of, we're going to leave it up to God to change the hearts. We're just going to be effective. And they were doing it on the streets. It wasn't sexy. To all of a sudden, and that was a first great awakening, to the second great awakening, where it's, man, if we have the right billboards, if we build the right environment, if I practice my speech to where it is eloquent enough, I could turn people's hearts. So there was a huge shift in America in the Second Great Awakening, where we see all of a sudden the pressure is on the leaders and the movements to be able to effectively bring about change. I think that that's one of the biggest things that we're still stuck in. So many practices of church marketing, so many practices of revivals, those sort of things that we see in different movements in America, I say find their roots to that shift in the Second Great Awakening.
Yeah, that's really interesting that you bring that historical context to bear. That does make sense in how it shapes us today and the kind of the values that we have today. Um, a very different form of evangelism for sure. I study a lot of the early church, and I think their
Mm-hmm.
jaws would like cartoonishly be on the floor, kind of thing. Sort of the things they see that we value and that we do to win people over to Christ. It's very, very interesting for sure. Well, I know you have this background with kind of the trauma informed theology, and you do a lot of this work with the Religious Trauma Network. So, kind of with that in mind, how can we recognize when maybe these systems or these leaders are really doing harm, even when they're kind of seem effective by worldly or sometimes Christian standards? How can we begin to tell when it's just a lot of talk about being big and great, and then when it slips into that arena of being like truly harmful to people in the pews?
Yeah, there's a lot there in that question. I think that some of the leadership marriage of like corporate leadership principles, marriage to ministry leadership from places like the Willow Creek Leadership Summit, just to name one, kind of the obsession with the John Maxwell craze, those sort of things, I think have put us into a place where we have married corporate leadership principles unhealthily. I'm not saying that there's not stuff there that we could learn to do better for our churches, but we've married kind of the two ways of leadership together. And so you have business and corporate leaders going to the same conferences as pastors to learn some of the same principles. And in that, if you remember Bill Hybels, who, was uncovered as an abuser a couple of years ago, he in his mantra over and over, I used to go every year to these events, his mantra over and over is, the local church is the hope of the world. The local church is the hope of the world. And what that mantra does, remember, language shapes, and it's a part of a culture that is a shaping culture. And the church is meant to be a discipling culture. And so what we are doing is we are shaping people with mantras like that into beliefs that the institutional church, that's how we think about church anyway. We don't have a good ecclesiology. Most people don't, where we understand church. So we automatically go to a place where, man, the institutional church, that's the hope of the world. And then, we use language that is somewhat biblical, the body of Christ, we're the hands and feet of Jesus. But then we tend to raise ourselves up to a place where it's like, well, that means that we're awesome and we are Jesus and we're the hope of the world. And when that happens, what winds up happening is we feel like we have to protect the institution and the leaders that shape the institution at any cost, including the cost of the victim. And it is very anti-gospel in so many ways. I mean, I could spend the rest of our remaining time just landing it. But what I'll get to the point to say is that Jesus, when he talks about being the good shepherd, in John 10, what he's doing in that day is actually in that day, Ezekiel 34 would have been read in the synagogue, which is God basically speaking harsh words against the leaders of Israel that he had left to tend his people to. And he's like, hey, you've scattered the flock. They're all over the place. Wolves are coming to eat them. And then he makes a promise, I will be the shepherd. I will be the good shepherd. And so in John 10, right after that moment happens, I believe it's a festival of dedication. Uh, what happens in that moment is Jesus, he turns to the leaders, and he doesn't call them good shepherds. He calls them hired hands. And he's like, hey, when trouble comes, you run. And then he says, I am the good shepherd. And so what we've done, and what he says is the good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. So a different, what I would say, corporate institutional Messiah value of the church that doesn't look like Jesus is that it sacrifices the victims for the sake of the institutional Messiah. Because we can't have anything come against us. We got to look great because we're the hope of the world. And so it'll sacrifice victims of sexual abuse and scandal, of all kinds of things, because they don't want the negative story coming out, because they're the hope of the world. But Jesus says, I lay down my life for the sheep, which means that if we are going to act like Jesus, instead of believing that we need to look awesome because we're the hope of the world, we sacrifice, and we do everything we can to prioritize those who've been harmed or hurt in our spaces, and those who have been connected to our spaces and our people at any cost for the sake of them. And honestly, that is what will represent the way of Jesus to the world, not us protecting our institution. The institutional Messiah concept goes all the way back to 1 Samuel, I believe it's 8, where they demand a king. Israel demands a king. And so God's like, all right, give it to him. I think it's like verse 20, verse 22 range. He's like, okay, give it to him. We want our talking heads, we want our institutions, because in some ways, following a Jesus that is counter to the ways of the world, and you use that term, the kind of the worldly ways, it's almost not good enough for us. I mean, I think about different things in the political sphere that have happened over the last 10 years where, we have people who are followers of Jesus that are saying things like, values from the Sermon on the Mount. Those don't work anymore. Russell Moore, he's the editor-in-chief of Christianity Today. He, quite a few times has talked about how when people teach on the Sermon on the Mount, it's often that their congregants come and say, what are those liberal woke talking points? Because we no longer are looking at the ways of Jesus and the worldly ways, and they've snuck their way into the church by not just politics, like I mentioned, but also the marriage of corporate leadership principles of impact. They've made their way in, and they don't all look like Jesus, but we think they do because they're impactful. And then we think, because our churches are growing, God must be in it. But then we see that our leaders lack the fruit of the Spirit. We see that our leaders' character lacks, even though they're impactful. So we've looked at things through lenses of worldly power and impact, as opposed to Jesus, the good shepherd who lays down his life for his sheep.
I've been writing a book and speaking and thinking more about this idea of efficiency as a I don't want to necessarily say anti-Christian thing, but not as the supreme Christian virtue, right? Efficiency is not our main metric, right? And I just it keeps coming back to that. It's an import from that corporate world kind of setting of, we need to streamline this and make this look good, and it becomes so much about numbers and results when half the time you just steamroll people in the way or ignore the other values. And to your point right at the beginning of what you were saying, we tend to protect our leaders and our systems even when they behave badly, because
Yeah.
of some perceived good. I mean, I've heard some comedians joke recently about how uh, whenever a famous celebrity person kind of gets in trouble for something, they get canceled, or there's some kind of abuse allegation or something, all of a sudden they find Jesus. And once
Mm,
they're a Christian, they're like protected because
yep.
now they're a famous person who's a Christian. We got to protect them at all cost and buy all their stuff and do all their things despite the sketchiness that was right there at the door. And
Yep.
that is a harsh but probably pretty fair accusation, that Christians are known as the people that protect the abusers, the not so
Yep.
great ones, just because of the name Jesus is slapped somewhere there. And
Yeah, I just had
yikes.
this conversation. I just had this conversation last week with somebody who I just said, "Hey, I totally respect you and your time in ministry, but I want to tell you that that we tend to protect predators at the cost of victims under the guise of grace." I'm
Yeah.
not saying they're not deserving of grace and they won't be fully, in God's eyes, redeemed if there's true repentance. But we as shepherds, as people who are called to protect those God gave us, need to act with wisdom. That's why Jesus is clear. He's like, be shrewd as a serpent, but innocent as doves. We need to carry ourselves in that place where we are protecting those who could potentially be harmed out of a place of innocence and kindness, but also at a place where we are wise and cunning in how we go about it.
Well, I really like your use of the term kind of shepherding. I think that's a apropos metaphor. It's super biblical right there in the text. Let's talk about maybe how we can move the church towards kind of a
Mm-hmm.
healthier structure. Practically speaking, what does it look like to be the good shepherd and not the hired hand that runs away?
Yeah. Well, let me go even higher level in that. Is we have to remember that Jesus only walked 3 miles an hour, and so we tend to outpace Jesus, as opposed to realizing sometimes if we need to catch up with him, we actually need to slow down. And so that's some of it. Is our pacing is off. It reminds me of the pacing of every empire since Egypt. It's like, how do we do more? I was at a conference where John Maxwell was speaking to pastors. They're like, we need to do more, we need to do more, and we need to do more before anybody else. We're Christians, we need to do more. It's like, no, maybe we need to do less. Maybe that's why Jesus is like, I'm the vine. you know you're the branches, talking about seasons of pruning so that there's more fruitfulness in the future. Like, if we learn some of those Jesus ways, it might help us. I think that at a higher level, understanding the pace and rhythm of Jesus, that is a King of Kings, Lord of Lords, that's changing the entire world by the power of his work and his kingdom. He only walked 3 miles an hour. And so that means that in our pacing, we must remain to a place not only to where our pacing is healthy, but where that pacing that's healthy for both ourselves as leaders, but also the institutions we run. There's certain things that we can do that seem good for us to do, but really, should we do them? And should we do them then? Or is there or are we going through a season of pruning where in another season it'll be more fruitful? I think to answer some of these questions based on the Jesus model would put us in healthier places. Then it would allow us to pay attention to ourselves as leaders, our emotions as leaders, our families as leaders, what our bodies are doing because when we're in stress mode all the time, because I know so many leaders that work ridiculous hours and have the pressure of, stupid politics and people coming at them, they move into stress mode and they're just functioning all the time. They're not paying attention to their bodies. And I think that if we learn to pace ourselves in the way of Jesus, Sabbath rhythms, all those things, it'll allow us to have less toxic, healthier selves And if we bring that same lens to our communities, it'll allow us to make healthier, non-toxic decisions. For the sake of our victims, going back, we realize for the same for them is that maybe our systems have been at a place where we haven't paid attention to them. Maybe they were abused because the system has been about impact and speed and protecting our CEO leader. And maybe we need to repent of that first and foremost. Hey, we need to get this right. And because of that, this person has been hurt, but I doubt they're the only one. They're just the only one that we know about at this moment. So at a higher level, it's that. The second piece is getting to a place where we understand, and there could be some psychological stuff around trauma here, but come to a trauma-informed place where we understand cognitive dissonance. So we understand as a congregant that when allegations are brought against our leader, that that instead of us trying to get to a place where we're comfortable by throwing out the allegations in our mind, we sit with the new information a little bit. Then the leaders of the church, when that information comes out, we actually help shepherd our people to say, hey, I understand that what you heard is hard. Don't try and just throw it out and determine what you think based on what you're most comfortable about. But we actually have trauma-informed shepherds that actually help shepherd people through moments when their leaders are caught in scandal, because people will go into protection mode, and protection mode to them is trying to be comfortable with information that they don't like and goes against what they believed about the person who's been leading them. Yeah. I know there's a bunch there. The question that you asked, there's so many spokes, like literally, I mean, we could spend the remaining a bit of this time just pulling that apart, but those are just some of the things I would toss out right away. Yeah.
Well, no, that's good to have that bird's eye view there. We're not like some podcasts where we just go for like 3 hours or whatever. Not this kind of podcast. Not what we do here. So we're gonna leave it at that. But as we kind of start to wrap up, I'm wondering if you can take a moment to switch gears a little bit, because we've talked a lot to churches, about churches. Now I'm hoping you can speak to an individual who maybe is, just a regular churchgoer in their congregation. They're not the culture maker. They're not the one on the stage, the things like that. But they're affected, right, by the impact and the ways that our leaders are lifted and can sometimes harm us. So, what would you recommend, or what would you say to somebody in the pews who is being harmed by these systems and maybe wants to kind of step away, or maybe sees church as not a safe place anymore?
Yeah. I would say that's okay. You may be farther along that journey of, some people are just coming to that reality. Some people aren't there yet. And some people are like, oh my goodness, get me out of here. So you could be anywhere in that spectrum. I would encourage you to have community outside of your specific church community, like your local community. And that's one of the things that I've learned. We tend to, in our idolatry of impact, and I'll use the term again, institutional messiah, we tend to sell the specific community on people as, if you come here, your family, this is all you need. We'll take care of all your problems. You'll be loved here and cared for. And it unintentionally isolates people. So I've learned, as I've been a part of communities over the years, it's important for me to have really close friends even outside of that community. Because when you're in it, you don't always see or feel what you feel until you're out of it. But people who are out of it can help you process what that looks like. Community could look different in different seasons or different needs. It's not necessarily, I tell people, do what you need to do for the sake of your nervous system, body, and your healing. And so if that means you step out and you go to a coffee shop for however period of time you need to and meet with friends to get support, that's your community in that next season. So I think that I would encourage you to have people and voices and close friends outside of the walls of the place that you call your home church, and to allow them to speak truth into some of the things that you're seeing that they might agree with, but have been holding back telling you if you've been telling them stories about what you're going through. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. I think that is not something you hear about. But hey, you should have friends from other churches. You're right. We want a place that is the end all be all, and
One
maybe
stop
that's
shop.
something. Maybe it's something to really think about, because I know a lot of churches are like, all right, well, we are, send your youth here on Wednesday and Friday night, and then, we'll see you on Sunday, and we'll do a Bible study here. And it becomes your entire life can be one church, and that
Yeah.
really can be isolating and
Yeah, it's cultish
perspectives.
without it
Yeah.
being a cult. That is cultish behavior. Now, I'm not
Mm,
saying it's necessarily toxic, but
sure.
it can become that way in a toxic church. And so I've just learned, cults actually want to isolate you and say we are what you need. But a lot of church communities unintentionally toss out those messages as they talk about its own goods and services. And in a way, without saying it, why we're better than the one down the street. So, yeah.
Yeah. I also love to joke how every single church thinks they're the friendliest, most welcoming church in town. It
Yep.
cracks me up because when a visitor comes in, no one talks to them. Hilarious
Yep.
in a bad way. But anyway, enough about that. Davis, thank you so much for all your wisdom today in the episode. A lot to think about and chew on. I appreciate your approach and your wisdom on these kind of difficult matters. And yeah, I wish we could have explored more of those spokes. But before we get to like the last question, everybody gets that wraps it all in a bow and gives us something to take home. I just want to know about some of your latest projects, what you're working
Hmm.
on, some links to send us to. You have a Substack, I believe.
Yep.
Like, send us all those cool places.
Yeah, so I'm one of the co-founders of the Religious Trauma Network, and so what we're doing is we're helping bring resources to help support survivors of religious trauma. And it's not just, we don't focus just in Christian spaces, though that's kind of the space in which I work mostly in. But it's there because we see some of the same dynamics in multiple types of religious systems and communities. And it could be something from like even the local yoga group up the road. I mean, you see some of the same type. I talked about it, cultish type tendencies at times that can do damage, that are isolating, that are abusive. And so we want to help survivors understand and get the resources and support they need. And then also, we want to help religious institutions be safer places to help avoid potential abuse, but also to respond to survivors as they come forward. And so I work with a denomination. I work with multiple consulting, sometimes quickly or not so quickly. I partner with Maricopa County, which is what Phoenix is in. And so some of the efforts with the Maricopa County Health in partnership with what's called Faithful Cities, which is a bunch of religious leaders that come together and are trained in trauma informed care. and and so I do a lot of that type of work here. A couple resources, you mentioned my Substack. I'm all over Instagram and Facebook, specifically Instagram. I put a lot of content out because there's not a lot of content or language to help people, whether they're leaders, which is what I mostly focus on, but also survivors. I am potentially, I'm coming down to the end of feeling whether or not it is done, but putting out a freebie resource of how pastors could respond to sexual abuse and sexual assault disclosure, just to help them understand what goes through the healing process and how to respond and not to respond to those sort of allegations. Because there's not a lot of training. Seminaries have failed training on this stuff, absolutely bombed it. I mean, like I said, I work specifically with a denomination, but there's multiple denominations I have consulted with. And I can tell you that 9 times out of 10, like we're far off the mark in responding to these things. And there's been next to no training. And a lot of the same mantras that are spat out turn into victim blaming, victim shaming, and minimizing abuse for the sake of institutions and leaders not taking ownership of their intentional and unintentional responses to these things. So I do a lot of work in that world, and yeah, hopefully that's helpful. I'm David underscore Ruybalid on Threads and Instagram. You could find, I'm sure, in the show notes how to spell my name there. And then I'm David Ruybalid at davidruybalid.substack. You could find me there. So yeah.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, I host this show and have my associated newsletter, Smashing Idols, also on Substack. So if you're already there checking out this show, jump over to David's Substack and share the love. Awesome. Well, again, you brought us a lot of great stuff today, a lot to think about with that opening story, how we kind of elevate impact, and then all the ways that can be really nasty, but also ways that if we just have a new ecclesiology, if we understand a little bit more about how these systems work and how they shouldn't work and how they should not be cultish, I think we're going to head to a much better place. So thank you so much for loving and supporting the church with what you do. Your ministry is super duper needed. So I am grateful for you putting all that stuff on Instagram and all those places.
Thank you.
Even though that's not where I hang out, but
Yeah.
you're forgiven. Well, we got one more question for you, of course, as I've alluded to. The final question every guest gets, so I'm going to read it and have you just kind of give us that last piece of wisdom. So here we go. As we close, leave the audience with just one practical action they can do this week to live out their faith fully for Jesus.
Yeah, as I was thinking through this, I think that realizing that God is at work in the places where you live, work, study, and play is key to enter into the practice of what I would say intentional Jesus like listening. And so, a lot of times, if we believe we are trying to push ourselves for impact, we want to tell people things. Hey, this is what you need to think. This is what you need to believe. Let me tell you how awesome my church is. Like, we want to tell people. But if we see the way that Jesus led, somebody would make a statement to him, and he was a question asker. He asked more questions, and he was brilliant. I would encourage you this week to look through the lens of God's already at work in the places where you live, work, study, and play. And whether you're in a break room at work or you're out doing yard work and then you begin talking with a neighbor, realize that God may be doing something. And in order to seek and find what he's doing, ask really good questions that draw other people to talk so that you can see what God is doing and might want to do, as opposed to trying to have impact and push. Let me tell you all the things. Let me tell you about my church. Those are some of the last things we need to move into. Seek, dig, see what God is doing, and do it through active, intentional, Jesus-like listening.
Well, can't argue with that. Thank you so much. That is a great bit of advice that we can do right now, right when we turn off the show and go talk to whoever we're going to talk to. And on that, I always end the show with a sharing challenge. So let's just piggyback off of that and let's talk about your neighbors, like maybe your geographic neighbors or your coworkers, whoever's around. Don't forget to let them know about the show, and specifically this episode with David. Let them know that there is a better way to view church than just big and messy and turning all our leaders into messiahs. So go ahead and do that. But David, it has been a blast to have you on. David Ruybalid. I think I said it right. And
Correct.
woo, yes. It's been awesome. Everybody should go check out your stuff. And thank you so much again.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Christianity Without Compromise. We just had a great episode, and don't forget to share that with all of your friends and your enemies. I encourage you to subscribe to us on Substack at jakedoberenz.substack.com. There you will find this show as well as our Friday newsletter. We want to create a space to get back to Jesus, and that community is a great one to be a part of. This episode was recorded by me, Jake Doberenz, in conjunction with Theophany Media. We are also members of the Kingdom First Ministries Broadcasting Network. Check them out at kfmbroadcasting.com. You guys are the best audience in the world, so go put into practice the wisdom and advice you got from this episode, and let's make the world a little bit more like Jesus. Thank ya.